Hi, so today we're going to make your, or assemble your back facing and your front facing. So this is your front facing. It's attached at the shoulders to your back facing. And then it's also attached to your upper collar, okay? And it just goes right into it will be sewn right to the jacket, just like I had it. So you're gonna come down and attach here, down, and everything should line up perfectly. Just like that. So on the back and the front, so that you can just sew right up and around, making sure you get your break points at the lapel and at the collar. Okay, and then you'll sew across the collar. With your front facing number 5, your back facing number 10, and your upper collar number 11, you will open this up so that your two front facings are facing each other, and then this piece is going to be sewn to this shoulder and this shoulder. So here's your shoulder seams. So you're going to pin that in place. Make sure you're matching your match points. And just like the back is sometimes bigger on your jacket, sometimes too the facing back will be bigger than your facing front, but it's not the case in this pattern. And then we'll take this to the machine and sew that in place. So at the machine, I have it set up for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's where my black tape is. And I'm just going to place this in so that I'm going to be back stitching first. So I'm just going to put my needle down. I'm set up with a 3mm stitch length. I'm just going to reverse a few stitches and then sew down my shoulder line. Marker line wasn't exactly at that 1/2 inch, so just make sure you're sewing exactly at your 1/2 inch. Okay, now we're going to take this to the ironing board and press it. So at my ironing board, you're going to press your seam open or towards the back. Just press that open and flat. All right, now we're going to attach our upper collar. Okay, so I have my back facing and my front facing sewn together at the shoulders. Everything is pressed, and now I'm going to match my upper collar. So I just want to mark my center back of the collar since we don't have a seam here. So I'm just going to do that right there on the center back. And then I want to do the same thing on the center back of my facing. So I'm just matching my shoulder seams and marking my center back. I'm going to bring that actually to front so that I can see it a little better. Mark your center back. You're going to place that right sides together, matching that center back seam, and then I like to just bring it around to my break point. So that's that one that we had to move. So I'm just going to, sorry, it's moved back a little bit. So line that up. So that needs to go a little bit more there. So match that up back there. And then this should be the same on this side. So you're going to match up that new break point. Perfect. Okay, and then you're going to take this to the machine and sew it. I like to sew it from the break point to the center and the break point to the center. I just find it just goes in better. Okay, so at the machine, just make sure you are setting your machine up for a log stitch and do your 3 stitches in place. And stopping with the needle down as much as possible to be like a third hand for you. So every time you go to reposition the fabric or turn or take a pin out, make sure that needle's down. And then anytime it starts to break off, that's when you're going to stop with that needle down, lifting up your foot and turning your fabric to reposition. And then I'm just going to turn this slightly, take a couple stitches, reposition. So your fabric on the seam allowance side is going to ripple a little bit, and that's okay as long as you take that ease and transfer it behind the needle. So my facing underneath there is exactly at my 1/2 inch line. And you can take this little ripple and just push it back. You just don't want to sew over them. Now make sure if you've pressed your seam allowances open to keep them open. So this, again, this little ripple can be moved back. And if you have the same, like you could feel that the same thing's happening on the bottom, just move that excess back. To my center, so I'm going to flip it and do the other side. You should see that it doesn't have any puckers or ripples on this side or on this side where the stitches are, and that the seam allowances stayed even. I'm going to just put an extra pin right here just to keep that edge even to start. Starting at my break point. Reducing my length down. And then going back up to my normal length. And then just curving around and making sure that my seam allowances or my cut edges match. The entire time, perfectly adjacent to the needle right here. I'm just feeling underneath to make sure that there's no puckers. And transferring that fullness to the back as much as I can. overlap my stitches, make sure they're exactly on top of each other again, not just butted together and not just barely, a full 2.5 centimeters or an inch. All right, so hopefully that is pucker free. Let's check the other side. Okay. No surprises, so everything fits well. We got our break points where we need them. Now you'll press this up, so we'll take it to the iron. Okay, so with your pressing hand, just press that seam flat. You're going to press your seam allowance up towards the collar, unless your pattern tells you to press it open and to clip it, which clipping does weaken your seam. So I'm only pressing just a little bit into the collar. Don't want to cause unnecessary creases anywhere. So, but you will trim and grade this down. We don't want to keep the 1/2 inch. It's too bulky. Okay, so now we can pin that onto our facing, or sorry, our jacket. So your facing actually will be into the jacket like this with, sorry, no, it's going to be into the jacket like this with this tucked in. And then this is what you will see on the outside of your lapel here. Your back facing will be inside the jacket. And your collar will turn down like that around, but like I said, it needs to be trimmed so that it can lay nice and smooth, so like that. On your jacket. Okay, so after ironing, I'm just going to trim down my seam allowance from my collar and my facing. So I've started grading this. So grading is when you're trimming the one seam allowance smaller than the other. So because I only have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm trimming my facing to 1/4 inch, and then my upper collar is going to be trimmed down to just over 1/8 of an inch. So, and I don't want to cut this all the way off at the ends because I need that to line it up with my under collar. So I'm going to leave my 1/2 inch here so I can match it to my under collar. And so across here, and I'll trim that later. Okay, and then on my facing, I'm cutting that about 1/2 of it off since I had a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trimming that down, and again, I'm being conservative at this time, and then I'll trim off more later when I go to attach it to the jacket, which would go on with my upper collar here would then attach to my under collar here, but I need to start with it right sides together and then matching all of my collar points, my break point, my lapel point, all the way down to my hem, like so. And then of course on this side, repeat that process where I'm going to go down, matching up my facing and my front jacket lapel. So the next step is to insert our facing and upper collar into our jacket. So you're going to want to start by pinning your center backs together. So make sure your center back is marked. I also marked my upper collar pivot point and also my lapel pivot point on both sides of my facing and upper collar, and then I also marked that on my jacket lapel. So let's get started. So we're going to take your upper collar and find your match point. Now the match point on your lower collar is right at the seam, so the center back seam there. And you're just going to pin this all the way around. Now the upper collar is 1/8 larger than your under collar, so you're just going to sew with that on the bottom side so that you can ease in the extra to the under collar. Where the reason why that's on there is so that when it's turned, the upper collar is just ever so slightly bigger and it rolls a little bit towards the under collar side so that it hides the under collar a little bit. So so there is my, sorry, I don't know if you can see that. So there is my upper collar and lower collar pinned together. And same thing on this side. Okay, so then you're going to also sew, so this is going to be sewn from the pivot point, so right here at the corner. And this is the part where I said don't cut it off, the seam allowance off just yet, because we want to make sure you match that up so that you end up getting that little bit of extra upper collar where it needs to be, because it is bigger. So just a little bit bigger right there. And I'll sew this exactly from my break point up, pivoting across to the other side. Again, these two seam allowances should match perfectly right here. And see how the upper collar is just a tiniest bit bigger. It has a little bit of a ripple. We're just going to ease that in when we stitch it down. Okay, so that's what we're going to do first. We're going to sew across the under collar, over and across, lock stitching at both ends. So it should look like this when it's completely pinned. So okay, so I don't know if you can see, but I put a little X right here, right where I am going to start with my lock stitch. Okay. So just make sure your seam allowance is back and out of the way, because you don't want to accidentally sew over it. Do a couple extra stitches just to be safe. All right, and then go ahead and increase my length there. And then I'm just sewing with my 5/8 inch seam, or sorry, 1/2 inch seam allowance right along the edge of that canvas. And then I'm going to pivot right on the corner. Oops, I think I went a bit too far, so I'm just gonna put that right in position. Right there on the corner, and then turn around my corner. Again, I'm just sewing right on the edge of my canvas, all the way around. Generally, I also like to stitch the collar from one point to the center and one point to the center, but because I'm stitching it to the canvas, I'm going to just continue on like this. technically, since I measured that so perfectly, it would be fine, but I also want to keep that upper collar on the bottom so it eases into my under collar. And if you can, set your machine up to stop with the needle down every time you take out a pin so it doesn't move on you. Okay, and again at this corner, make sure you pivot right at your corner and keep the seam allowance. Oops, sorry about that. Keep your seam allowance nice and straight there. And I probably shouldn't have taken that pin out so soon. It's a little bit premature. Okay, so take that, and you're gonna go right to that pin or your stopping point and backstitch, or you can lock stitch. Just keep it tidy. Okay, so I'm showing you here. So I'm just checking. So my other stitch ends right. Can you see it in this light? Right there, and my one I just did ends right there. So they're just as almost as close as I can get together. So let's check the other side. And yeah, everything is right there. So now we're going to sew across this lapel, the very top of the lapel. I don't want you to do this all in one go because I'm going to have you go from the point to this break point. Then you're going to trim it, and then we'll fold it down and sew here, and that will give you a nice crisp corner. Okay, so with my marker, I marked exactly where my stitch here ends, which it's easy to see on this side, but on this other side, because I used a different color thread, and yours of course will be matching thread, I used light purple here, so I marked it here so I can mark exactly where I'm stopping and starting. Okay, so I'm going to take this and I'm just going to fold this out of the way because I do not want to accidentally sew it. I'm going to pin that so that the edges are even. And again, your facing, it should be 1/8 of an inch larger than your jacket lapel. If it's not, this is something that you would correct on the pattern before you cut everything out. But okay. So because I have the canvas here, ideally, actually, I would sew from here to the corner and out, so I can go from exactly where my stitch is in there across to the corner. So just going to place that into the machine. Okay, so do a lock stitch there. Okay, and then increase your length and stitch around your canvas. Right to the end. Okay, so now I'm going to do the other side. So I've pinned it, and this time I'm going to go right from where it stopped, right here to the end here. So right there. And again, I'm going to start out with a lock stitch. Just don't trust them right here at the break point. So make sure your seam allowance from your collars are out of the way. So we only want to be sewing the facing and the lapel. Right across to the end. just like that there. So that should go right to your little spot there that we marked. And then I'm gonna check the inside. That should all be, like all three of those should be lined up right now. Okay, so then we're going to trim this seam allowance the rest of the way. Okay, so if you recall, we only trimmed this facing and collar seam allowance to a point and then stop so that we can maintain our seam allowance. So now you're going to finish trimming that. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and grade it so that the one is a little shorter than the other. Okay. And since we've now sewn the collar, we're also going to trim and grade that. So your upper collar is left longer, so it will be only trimmed off half of its seam allowance, and the facing, so the under collar, will get trimmed off a bit more than half of its seam allowance. So you'll trim it 1/8 of an inch more than the upper collar. And then that applies to the whole thing. So you'll trim your whole under collar around and your upper collar as well. So just like that. Okay, so I've gone ahead and trimmed the rest of it. So again, your upper collar is going to be left just a little bit longer than your under collar. So like that. So hopefully you can see this in this light. Normally I don't like to cut my corners or trim my corners, but I did trim it a little bit because this collar is just so small. But I left 1/8 of an inch here. So leave at least 1/8 of an inch there, otherwise you will end up with it being too weak and too fragile. Okay, so and then I also trimmed my lapel seam allowance here and here, so you can see the difference. On the jacket side, it got trimmed a little bit more than the facing side. Okay, and this has been sewn across the upper collar, so just from here over and down. And then I've also sewn the top of the lapel across here all the way to the tip, and across the lapel all the way to the tip. Okay, so then your next step is going to be to pin this whole edge together along this edge. Pin it like that, and then up here your facing is what's going to show at the top. So you want the seam allowance to be folded towards the jacket, and then we're going to stitch right down this. So you're going to fold that right on your stitching line, so right on that edge there of the stitching line, so right there. And it is a little, and then you're going to sew right down that edge. So you'll see on this side that I folded it. And then you're going to stitch your 1/2 inch seam allowance down this edge. I'm going to actually start here, which is not something I normally do, because I usually like to backstitch first, but because I need that fold done sewn and it's so small, I started right on top of it. Okay, so on this one, other side, again, I've rolled that seam allowance towards my jacket lapel, and I'm just going to stitch right next to my canvas like I did with the under collar, all the way down to the hem, and I've folded that seam allowance over. Just bring that in a little bit. I did my back stitch, and I'm just going to sew right along the canvas. And ideally, I would have done a little better job trimming my canvas because there's a couple spots that I could tell wasn't half an inch. So this is the sewn lapel from both sides. Okay. So at the lapel roll line, which is here, we haven't talked about that much, the fabric is going to go from the facing being on top, like this, to the jacket being on top, like that. So that's going to happen at the roll line. So this will switch over right like there, so that this is predominant on this side, so the facing is predominant, and then below that the jacket is predominant. So because of that, when you trim this seam allowance, you're going to again grade it, but you're going to grade it so that the jacket is longer below the roll line, the jacket seam allowance, and then above the roll line the facing seam allowance will be longer. So facing will be shorter below the roll line, facing will be longer above the roll line. Okay. Okay, so I started trimming this off so that you can see that below my roll line, my facing has a shorter seam allowance, and my jacket has a longer seam allowance. And then I've started trimming off I've already trimmed off my jacket lapel to a shorter seam allowance, and now I'm going to just finish this off by trimming this off with my last little bit. Okay, so that is your trimmed lapel. Okay, so you can see that I made them different from each side, and then I'll repeat that on the other side. And then I will again trim my seam allowance so the jacket is longer on the lower half, and then the facing is shorter on the lower half. So right about to there. And then it's going to switch out, so it's the longer one. Careful, you're not catching the underside. Okay, and then repeat that. So this is going to be the longer one now. And then up here, it's going to switch to the shorter one. All right, and then I can cut a little bit off my corner. Okay. So hopefully you can see that. And hopefully you can see that. Okay, so now I'm just going to stick my thumb in there. And I want to fold that right where I've stitched it over my thumb. And I'm going to poke it out and check that. So usually what makes a corner not flat and smooth is that the seam allowance is bunched up. So if you didn't get the seam allowance flat, it will not lay flat. And this is actually why I don't like trimming the corners, because it's hard to keep a clipped corner flat. I do have a little purple thing, which is literally the name of it, and it can help tuck out or push out the corner without damaging it. But again, you want to make sure you're not squishing the seam allowance and making it bunched up. So there. So I had a threaded needle. Yes, I do. Okay. I could go into this corner and gently pull that corner out. Just make sure you get a solid chunk of it if you're going to do this. Don't just grab a few threads. And then you can use your needle to tuck in that seam allowance a little bit, right where the stitches are exposed and showing. So it's not the prettiest because it's tiny and bulky, but if this was a larger lapel, you could make that look a lot better. Okay, then you're going to repeat that on your collar. So fold those seam allowances exactly. So I call this the fold and hold. So you're going to fold that seam allowance right where you've sewn it on both parts of that corner. Hold it and then flip it over your thumb. And you should end up with a very nice corner like that. One more area I almost forgot you need to clip your seam allowance on is your this is your jacket lapel. Right where the break point is, you're going to clip that so that the seam allowance can stay going up one way, but then on the lapel it can go the other way, because we stitch this two up, but here it goes in, so we want to make sure you clip that. And then the same thing on this part, the other side on the lapel, the facing side, clip that to your break point. Okay, so and then a bit of pressing, and I haven't pressed that seam allowance here yet either. So I've pressed it, but I'm going to press it one more time so that it lays flat like this. Okay. Again, I'm taking both my seam allowances and I'm pressing them up towards the collar. If it lines up perfectly, do please go ahead and stitch in the ditch or top stitch or nice or edge stitch rather along that seam. I'm just taking some of my shoulder tailor tacks out. Okay, so I have not clipped this side, so that's why it's not laying flat. Don't cut your stitches. There you go. All right, now this should flip over and lay flat. Okay, so I've clipped that and I've just pinned it in place so you can get an idea of how this is going to go. So at the ironing board, remember you're going to press your jacket seam allowance towards your facing below the roll line. And then above the roll line where you've clipped it, you're going to press that seam allowance towards the jacket. Okay, so then when you roll this back, a little bit of the jacket should be showing below the roll line, and then it should switch above the roll line so that the lapel facing is on top. So then when you press your roll line again, it has that break point again. Then it rolls nicely. Okay, so I'm going to take this. I'm just going to press this right here. So doesn't need a lot of heat or pressure, but then all right, so that is what your. And then you can choose how to sew that, either stitching in the ditch or hand sewing it on the inside to the seam allowance. Now, all right. And this would be how it looks from the underneath side of the collar. So. All right. Okay, so I decided that I'm going to try to do the stitch in the ditch because when I pinned this, I noticed that my pins were right about where I wanted it to be for my stitch in the ditch on the back side. So, and since it's the collar, whoops, since the collar is going to technically hide everything, I'm going to go ahead and go with that. So let's just bring this in. And I don't have to do it the whole way, just enough to keep it anchored. So I'm just going to go from the shoulder seam around. Stitching in the ditch is right when you stitch right where that seam, those two seams meet. Like I mentioned, it's not going to show, so because the collar will completely hide it, so I'm okay with that for the sample. All right, I can take these out. Okay, so this is your finished collar and lapel. So we've now sewn both sides. You can see where we did our zigzag stitch. That would be in matching thread, and because it's underneath, it wouldn't show. And then this side is the one that we pad stitched. So ideally, you wouldn't see any of those stitches. So either way you choose to do it, it will should end up not being visible from the right side. So that is our finished one. And then just to show you what it looks like on the back side. So when that's on the body, it will lay flat and tight around the neck. And then the underside looks like this. All right, and then our stitch in the ditch there. I did go a little bit far away there. And then on the right side, you can kind of see where I pulled a bit too hard, but none of this will show when the collar is folded down. So as long as you're getting as close as you can to that under collar with as little on the jacket as possible, you could either make it look so it's like this on the whole time or just underneath the whole time. Try to be consistent. So then after we get our sleeves on and our shoulder pads in and our sleeve head done, then you will add your lining to this facing piece that's not attached to anything, and then you're done.